tell-all book, not due to be published until Tuesday. The details are scathing, and they are sure to anger Donald Trump. According to the Associated Press, the former FBI director says Trump was unethical and untethered to the truth. It also appears that Trump's effort to secure Comey's loyalty began before the inauguration, when he and other top intelligence officials visited Trump Tower. Comey reportedly writes that to him the demand was like Sammy the Bull's Cosa Nostra induction ceremony, and refers to the forest fire that is the Trump presidency. I'm joined now by Phil Rucker from the Washington Post, who has read the book, as well as former Watergate prosecutor Nick Ackerman and Natasha Bertrand, the staff writer for The Atlantic. Phil, let's start with you. You've been burning the midnight oil reading this book. What stood out to you?
Well, it's a really stunning tell-all, more than 300 pages, and in it, James Comey, the fired FBI director, details in really vivid scenes all of his conversations with President Trump, beginning during the transition phase before he became president. It was Comey who traveled to Trump Tower in New York and briefed the president-elect one-on-one about the most lewd allegations in that dossier, the infamous intelligence dossier by Mr. Steele that we've been talking so much about. And Trump took it in a very difficult way. He became fixated on this subject and would repeatedly try to prove to Comey that these allegations were not true. He did so in that Trump Tower briefing. He did so again in a phone call a week or so later, and again and again. And Comey details all of it in his book. This is according to his account. And the big picture, Ali, about the portrait that Comey paints of the president is about as scathing as it gets. He describes the president as a congenital liar, as somebody who is just simply unethical and unfit for this office, and someone who was really blurring what should be traditional boundaries between the White House, the politics in the White House, and the more independent FBI and Department of Justice. Comey was very alarmed and described it as a forest fire of a presidency.
Phil, let's talk about these lewd allegations that the president seemed to be obsessed with. Did he ask Jim Comey to do anything about it? Does Comey write about whether he believes those allegations to be true or what he was asked about them?
He did. So Comey, the allegation is that during a trip to Moscow in 2013, then private citizen Donald Trump was in a hotel room in the Ritz-Carlton and was taped by the Russians interacting with prostitutes in that hotel room. These are not confirmed allegations. Comey made that clear in his conversations to Trump, that this was part of the intelligence dossier, but there was no independent confirmation of them. But Trump told Comey they were not true, and he then told Comey he wanted the FBI to fully investigate the allegation because it had been so painful for the First Lady, for Melania Trump. Comey said that the FBI would investigate that, and did. But the president was really fixated on it and came back to it again and again and again, including at that loyalty dinner, the one-on-one dinner that Comey and Trump had at the White House, in the green room of the White House, where the president asked the FBI director for his personal loyalty. One of the subjects they talked about was the incident with the prostitutes, the alleged incident with the prostitutes in Moscow.
So James Comey did not put forward anything in his book about the veracity of that allegation.
That's right. That's right. Although he does have a section in the book where he describes some of the reasons that President Trump gave to him for why these allegations could not be true. And Comey sort of narrates in his own voice that he was thinking of all the reasons why they, in fact, could be true, despite what the president was saying. But Comey does not render any judgment about the allegations. And again, just so all the viewers understand, these are unconfirmed allegations that were part of that dossier by the former British intelligence officer, Christopher Steele.
Phil, let's talk a little about John Kelly, who apparently spoke to Jim Comey right after he was fired, or soon after he was fired.
That's right. So this is on May 9th, 2017, the day Comey was fired. And John Kelly at the time was the Homeland Security Secretary. He had developed a relationship with Comey. He called Comey on the phone. Comey was out in Los Angeles that day, you'll recall. And Kelly told Comey that he was really taken aback by the firing, by the ouster. He thought it was sad. He was sick about it. That's the word that Comey used to describe how Kelly was. And Kelly said he thought about quitting. He threatened to resign because he didn't want to work for dishonest dishonest people, which is assumed to be a reference to the president. Of course, Kelly did not resign. Comey writes in his book that he convinced Kelly to stay in the job because this president especially needs to have principled people with integrity around him.
I want to talk about John Kelly for a moment because obviously John Kelly will be asked about this, or Sarah Huckabee Sanders will be asked about this. John Kelly is on the record now. The nation knows he's a liar about certain things. He lied about Congresswoman Frederica Wilson. John Kelly apparently told Comey, according to Comey's recollection, that he would resign over this?
That's right. He told Comey, according to Comey's account, that he wanted to quit his job as the Homeland Security Secretary because he couldn't handle working anymore for people that Comey said that Comey described Kelly as describing them as being dishonest people. And Kelly told Comey he wanted to resign over that. Comey convinced Kelly to stay in the job. This is all according to Comey's account. And of course, Kelly did stay in the job. And 2 months later, he was appointed the White House Chief of Staff. All
right. It's just important to know that because tomorrow, of course, these questions will be asked. I expect John Kelly will deny it. I just think it's important to remind the nation that John Kelly has lied on the record.
And Ali, one other thing that's important to point out so viewers understand, this whole memoir, the accounts of his interactions with Trump, the conversation with Kelly, it's all based on contemporaneous notes that Jim Comey took as the FBI director. After every call with Trump, after every meeting with Trump, he would go basically write a diary entry detailing all of what happened, the dialogue, the body language, what he saw in the room at the time, how he felt at the time. So this is not a memoir he's writing a year after the fact. It's based on his notes in real time.
Why does he say that he did that? Did he do that in every meeting he ever had as FBI director, or was this a Trump-specific thing?
Well, he did it in a lot of meetings, and as an FBI director and as a prosecutor and in his line of work, he was trained to take detailed notes, to rely on those notes, to observe things and remember things. But he felt as he began to interact with Trump, their first meeting was in that transition period, that briefing at Trump Tower. He felt that these were such odd interactions that he wanted to have a record of it. So he would take those notes, write those memos, diary entries, and then he actually shared them with some of the other senior officials at the Department of Justice, or rather at the FBI, so that there would be witnesses, if it were, to what happened.
Let me bring in Natasha and Nick. Natasha, I want to ask you about this because Comey in the book, according to Phil, writes about Jeff Sessions that he's overwhelmed and overmatched by the job. But what's important here is that Comey said to Sessions, after Trump had asked him to leave the room, Comey says to Sessions, "You have to be between me and the president." Obviously, that didn't happen in the end. Is that material? Is that relevant?
It is, because as we've seen, the president was absolutely furious with Jeff Sessions for ultimately recusing himself from the Russia investigation. So the fact that Sessions did not kind of heed that call to place himself between the president and James Comey kind of adds to this idea that perhaps he helped the president obstruct justice, because, of course, he did write that letter that supported the president's decision to fire James in May. And when he did decide to recuse himself from the investigation earlier on, he really drew the ire of the president, and the president obviously then moved to fire him, or wanted to fire him, asked him for his resignation over the summer of that year. So this is definitely something that can be looked at as well. Why did Sessions not go along with this?
Nick Ackerman, the interesting and the most interesting thing about Donald Trump is that I don't think he's going to wait till Sunday now or Monday or Tuesday to start tweeting about this book. He'll react to Phil Rucker's comments and other comments from people who have read the book, and that could imperil him with respect to this investigation, because the president will now try to diminish Jim Comey's standing in the public.
And I think he'll give more publicity to the book. He'll wind up selling more copies of the book for Jim Comey than any PR person could do. So it's just going to take more interest in the book. It's going to put a bigger spotlight on Comey's side of the story, all of which we heard has all been documented with notes and contemporaneous memos. I mean, the things that he's saying aren't extraordinary up to this point. I mean, we all know that Donald Trump is unethical. We know he can't be trusted. He's probably lied more than any president that we have ever had. What I did find interesting, though, was about this incident in 2013 in Moscow at the time of the Miss Universe pageant. To really dig into that, I mean, why he would be so focused on that and keep asking about it, I find actually sort of interesting, almost like if it really was nothing, then why wouldn't he let him do it? And we know that Christopher Steele had 7 independent sources basically saying the same thing. I mean, based on that information, if he were not president of the United States, he wouldn't qualify for a national security pass. I mean, he wouldn't be able to get a clearance. And certainly from the standpoint of probable cause, just based on those 7 people, you have enough for a search warrant, enough for a wiretap. And he also had to know, as president, asking Comey to investigate that, there's no way the FBI can go to Moscow and start talking to the same sources that Christopher Steele did. That's impossible. It's almost like he's asking for something that could not possibly be done. We're never going to really know the truth on this matter until there's a regime change in Moscow, just like there was, you know, a number of years ago, and we learned a lot of the things that were in the KBG files. This is the kind of thing we're only going to get to the truth on about 30 or 40 years from now, when there's a complete change in Russia.
So what was the implication, Phil Rucker, that that Donald Trump wanted James Comey to investigate the lewd allegations there, or he wanted James Comey to come out and say that they're untrue, from your reading of the book?
It's actually both, Ali. It said Donald Trump wanted James Comey, as the FBI director, to conduct an investigation into these allegations in order to prove that they were not true. So he wanted the FBI to look into it, and then he wanted the FBI to be able to report, based on an investigation, that the allegations were not true. It was very important to him that the FBI look into it and that the FBI come publicly and make it clear that they're not true.
Natasha Bertrand, does this do anything at all to where we are right now in the Russia investigation, with the president standing, with the fact that there's been endless reporting, including from Phil's colleagues, that the president is livid? He is off balance this week because of the raiding of his lawyer, Michael Cohen's office. At this point, the president, who was probably going to be this angry on Monday night or Tuesday, we're going to get an advanced taste of it.
Yeah, I think that more than anything, what struck me about Phil's reporting about this book is the fact that after Trump received this intelligence briefing from the FBI director, from top national security officials, the thing that he fixated on the most was this dossier. The thing after receiving all this information about how Russia had interfered in our election, about how they had essentially compromised our entire democratic process, how they had attacked the country, basically, what he fixated on was allegations that he had prostitutes pee on a bed in Moscow in order to soil President Obama's bed. So that speaks to a broader point that Jim Comey made later on when he testified before the Senate Intelligence Committee about his firing, which is that the president never seemed interested in the substance and the meat of Russia's election interference. He never seemed interested in, okay, well, how can we counter this? How can we punish Russia for this? How can we prevent it from ever happening again? Instead, and what this book really shows, is that he, from the very beginning, has been fixated on how this affects him, how it reflects on him, rather than how it affected the country.
And Phil, to that point, the Jim Comey talks a lot about loyalty oaths. He sort of, according to your reporting, relies a lot on this discussion that Donald Trump wanted loyalty. He wanted loyalty oaths.
That's exactly right. He wanted loyalty from Comey, from his FBI director, and Comey was not prepared to give it. He said he would be loyal to the truth. He would not be loyal personally to President Trump. And it wasn't just Trump who was fixated on sort of blurring these lines between the FBI and the White House. The whole administration, or the whole White House rather, seemed to not really understand the difference between what the FBI does and what the White House does. And Comey describes a scene where he went over to the West Wing to have a meeting with Reince Priebus, then the chief of staff of the White House, and spent 20 minutes explaining to Priebus how the White House should operate with the FBI and with the Department of Justice, what's appropriate, what's not appropriate to maintain the independence of the Bureau. And at the end of that meeting, Priebus told Comey, hey, come on down the hallway. I want you to come say hello to the president. He wants to see you in the Oval Office. And Comey writes that he thought to himself, this is so ironic. I just spent 20 minutes explaining how we need to be independent, and here you are trying to bring me in to see the president. And indeed he did, and they had a conversation there.
Nick Ackerman, does any of this have an impact on the Mueller investigation? I mean, it's obviously going to have an impact on public opinion, and people can decide whether they like Jim Comey or not, whether they trust Jim Comey or not. But does it have any standing or influence on the investigation?
Well, I think it's going to certainly impact the investigation to the importance of it, and that people realize that it's important that Mueller continue doing it. What's really unusual here is that Jim Comey is a star witness in any obstruction of justice prosecution. He's a star witness in a whole series of items that relate to Trump and people around him. And it's very unusual to have your star witness go out and do a bestseller book that can then be used to cross-examine him. So he had to do what the prosecutor would want him to do, which is to make sure that he has put in there everything that is material that he will testify to, because the last thing he wants to do is get on the witness stand and suddenly come up with additional testimony that he hadn't put in this book, because they're going to ask him why he didn't do that.
So in other words, one can trust, or one should assume, that the stuff that Jim Comey has written in this book is better vetted or more accurate than necessarily if I wrote a book, because he knows that Mueller's people are going to go through this thing.
That's right, and that's what he's going to testify to, and he's going to have to stick to what he's saying in that book. So he had to be very careful. On the other hand, if he's got contemporaneous memos and notes upon which this book was written, that makes it pretty easy.
Phil Rucker, any sense of whether those contemporaneous notes have been subpoenaed?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. I know Comey has been cooperating with Mueller as the special counsel.
So it may not have had to have been subpoenaed. It may have been volunteer.
I don't know. Yeah, and I imagine that the accounts that Comey has given to Mueller and his investigators are more detailed than what he's written in this book.
Is Comey self-critical in the book at all?
He is. You know, he talks a little bit about how he knows over his years he's had a reputation for having a healthy ego, for sometimes being a little sanctimonious. He acknowledges that. And he also talks about his own sort of experiences. Remember, it's a memoir, so he talks about through his entire life. But as you read it, you can't help but think about Trump. There's a whole chapter in it about how Comey used to be bullied at school as an elementary school student, as a high school student, slammed against the lockers, teased and ridiculed by his classmates, and he sort of ruminates on the psychology of bullies and then the psychology of liars, and he seems to be writing that in sort of a thinly veiled assessment of the occupant of the Oval Office.
Natasha, this all comes within the context of reporting by NBC that the Mueller probe could ramp up now that they're coming to terms with the fact that Donald Trump, in his anger this week, has soured on the idea of sitting down with Robert Mueller, something he had thought he would do. The Mueller investigation can ramp up without that. Where do you think this sort of places the investigation and Donald Trump?
Well, my reaction when I read that was that Mueller has enough to finish his obstruction report without actually having to interview the president. There's reason to believe that they would be able to subpoena the president to be interviewed if they felt like that was absolutely necessary. But the fact now that they have written essentially 4 different points at which they believe that the president tried to obstruct justice, tried to end this investigation or impede it, really says a lot. And one of the most striking things about it is that they apparently have evidence that he was dangling bribes to grand jury witnesses, and that is huge if it's true. And if to sit down with the president, because the president is kind of throwing a temper tantrum about the raid on his lawyer's home, which of course there was a warrant for and it was perfectly lawful, then that's really going to damage him, because he won't be able to have the opportunity to tell his side of the story. Now, of course, his allies have really strongly urged him against sitting down with Mueller because they feel that it could be a perjury trap. But there is something to be said about, well, if you think that you are telling the truth and you really, really believe that you have nothing to hide, then why not just sit down with Mueller and get this over with?
And Nick, to that point, Comey, who again is going to know that more than most people, more than fire and fury, there are going to be lawyers and investigators going through this book with a fine-tooth comb. So Comey's credibility here is at stake in a way that most authors' credibility is not. And according to what he said to Phil Rucker, or what Phil Rucker read in the book, Comey says about Trump that he built a cocoon of alternative reality that he was busily wrapping around all of us, that he lies about all things large and small. Comey is setting himself up as something opposite to Trump, that Comey must be telling the truth and Trump must be lying.
Well, that's what we've seen anyway. I mean, Comey's not giving away the store here. I mean, that's what we've seen with this individual during the campaign, after the campaign. I mean, the number of times he has lied about even inconsequential things is staggering. So he's not telling us anything new from that standpoint. But again, Comey is the kind of person who kind of puts himself up as somebody who's a little bit holier than thou, which led to that statement he made in ending the Clinton email investigation, which he had no business making, when he got up there and they criticized her for being careless. I mean, he had no business making any of those statements in the first place. That should have been done by the Attorney General or the Deputy Attorney General, not by the FBI. I mean, this is the first time ever the FBI director has gone out and made a statement about an investigation. That is just not proper.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.